This is a fictional story inspired by real life. Claire had been an orphan since she was a very young girl, carrying the weight of a world that never truly felt like it belonged to her. Now, she was nearly 8 months pregnant, her body heavy with a life that was both a miracle and a burden she bore alone. The family she had married into, people who were supposed to be her sanctuary, had turned their backs on her in the cruelest way possible. Under a relentless gray English downpour, they had forced her out of their home without a suitcase, without a single penny, and without a soul to speak a word of protest or kindness. The mud of the rural outskirts near the city of Durham clung to her worn shoes, making every step a grueling battle against gravity and exhaustion. Claire did not beg for mercy, for she had learned long ago that some hearts are made of stone and no amount of tears can soften them. She walked through the drenching rain, her hands cradling her swollen belly, as if her very touch could shield her unborn child from the cold reality of their abandonment. The sky was a bruised purple, and the wind whipped through the ancient oak trees, whispering secrets of a winter that was arriving far too early for a woman with nowhere to go. In the distance, nestled at the edge of a forgotten lane, stood an old stone cottage with a roof made of weathered slate and walls that seemed to lean into the hillside for support. It was a house that looked as if it had been holding its breath for many years, waiting for a reason to exhale. Claire noticed the back door was slightly ajar, swaying just a few inches in the gale like an invitation from a stranger. With her strength fading and her breath coming in ragged gasps, she pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped into the thick, dusty silence of a home that had forgotten the sound of footsteps. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and old memories, but the kitchen was dry, and that was all that mattered in that desperate moment. There was a large stone hearth in the corner, cold and filled with the gray ash of fires that had burned out a lifetime ago. Claire did not think of her own comfort, nor did she wonder whose house she was intruding upon. She thought only of the tiny life kicking beneath her ribs. With trembling fingers, she searched the shadows until she found a few scraps of dry kindling and a single, lonely match tucked away in a tin. She knelt on the hard floor, her joints aching and her back screaming in protest, and struck the match with a prayer on her lips. The flame was tiny at first, a golden speck against the overwhelming darkness of the room, but she nurtured it with the patience of a mother. She blew softly on the embers, watching as the orange glow began to eat away at the wood, slowly filling the cold kitchen with a gentle, flickering warmth. It was not a fire built for her own sake, but a beacon of hope for the baby who deserved a warm place to enter the world. As the heat began to seep into her bones, the sheer exhaustion of her journey finally caught up with her, and her eyes grew heavy. She curled up on the hard floor next to the hearth, using her thin cloak as a makeshift pillow and her arms as a shield for her child. She fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, unaware that this house belonged to a man named Arthur, who was returning to these walls to live out his final days in the solitude of his grief. She had no way of knowing that by lighting that fire she had inadvertently disturbed a silence that had lasted for over 10 years. The house Claire had found was not merely a building, it was a reliquary of a life that had been cut short far too soon. It had once belonged to Elise, Arthur's only daughter, a woman who had filled these rooms with the scent of lavender and the sound of humming. When Elise passed away, the light seemed to drain out of the valley, and Arthur had locked the doors, unable to bear the sight of the empty chairs and the dust settling on his daughter's dreams. He had moved to a small, cramped apartment in the city, trying to outrun the ghost of his own sorrow, but time eventually caught up with him. Now, at 70 years of age, Arthur was returning to the stone cottage because he no longer had the strength to run from the past. He walked down the muddy lane with a heavy iron key pressed into the palm of his hand, his coat buttoned tight against the damp British autumn. Every step felt like a milestone, a slow march toward the end of his own story, and he expected to find nothing but shadows and cobwebs waiting for him. He wanted to spend his remaining time in the quiet, surrounded by the things Elise had touched, even if those things only served to remind him of what he had lost. As he reached the gate, he stopped in his tracks, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the chimney that rose above the slate roof. A thin, delicate ribbon of white smoke was curling up into the rainy sky, dancing against the gray clouds like a ghost. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm he hadn't felt in years, as confusion wrestled with a sudden sharp spike of indignation. No one was supposed to be in that house, and no fire should have been lit in that hearth since the day they carried Elise out through the front door. He walked around to the back of the cottage, noticing the mud tracked across the stone step and the way the door sat slightly uneven on its hinges. He pushed it open slowly, the wood groaning, as if it were protesting the return of its master after so much time. The first thing he smelled was not the dust he expected, but the sweet, sharp scent of burning cedar and the faint, unmistakable aroma of a lived-in space. The kitchen was no longer a tomb. It was warm, and the shadows were jumping on the walls in time with the flickering light of a small, steady fire. Arthur stood in the doorway, his old lantern trembling in his hand, and his gaze fell upon the figure huddled on the floor. At first he thought his mind was playing tricks on him, conjuring a vision of his daughter from the depths of his longing. But as he stepped closer, he saw that the woman was a stranger, her face pale and exhausted, her clothes soaked through and stained with the red clay of the hills. She was sleeping with a hand protectively over a belly that was ripe with the promise of new life, a stark contrast to the deathly stillness he had prepared himself for. He wanted to shout, to demand to know who she was and how she dared to enter his sanctuary of sorrow, but the words died in his throat. There was something about the way she looked, so vulnerable and yet so determined even in her sleep, that silenced his anger. She had used the old wood from the bin, the very wood Elise had stacked herself a decade ago, to create a circle of warmth in a house that had been frozen in time. Arthur leaned against the doorframe, the iron key feeling heavy and useless in his pocket, as he watched the stranger breathe in the warmth of a fire he had never intended to light again. The flickering light of the lantern cast long, distorted shadows across the kitchen as Arthur remained frozen in the doorway, his breath hitching in his chest. He looked at the woman's shoes, which were caked in thick, dark mud, telling a silent story of a long walk through the unforgiving night. She looked like she had come from nowhere, and had nowhere else to go, a wanderer who had stumbled into the one place on earth that was closed to the world. He felt a strange, uncomfortable tug in his chest, a mixture of resentment for the intrusion and a dormant, dusty sense of pity. Claire stirred in her sleep, her brow furrowing as a soft moan escaped her lips, likely from the discomfort of the hard floor against her aching back. She shifted her weight, her hand tightening its grip on her stomach, and for a moment Arthur saw the unmistakable silhouette of a life moving beneath the fabric of her dress. It was a sight that felt almost violent in its vitality, a reminder of the future in a house dedicated entirely to the past. He coughed softly, a dry, rasping sound that echoed through the small room like a gunshot, and watched as the woman bolted upright. Her eyes snapped open wide and filled with a primal, instinctive fear that made Arthur take a step back toward the rain-slicked porch. She scrambled to sit up, her movements clumsy and pained by the weight she carried, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. She did not scream or beg. Instead, she looked him directly in the eye with a gaze that was far older than her years. There was no defiance in her expression, only a quiet, resolute exhaustion that seemed to say she had already survived the worst the world could throw at her. "I didn't mean to steal anything, sir," she said, her voice raspy and thin, but remarkably steady despite the circumstances. She stayed on the floor, one hand supporting her weight, and the other still guarding her child, refusing to look away from the old man who stood before her. Arthur didn't answer immediately, his gaze wandering from her face to the small fire she had managed to sustain. He felt like a stranger in his own home, caught between the urge to protect his privacy and the inability to cast a pregnant woman out into a storm that showed no signs of stopping. "Why did you light the fire?" he finally asked, his voice sounding foreign even to his own ears, like a bell that hadn't been rung in a century. He didn't ask her name or where she came from. He asked about the fire, because that was the one thing that felt like a betrayal of his grief. Claire looked at the hearth, the orange flames casting a golden glow over her features, making her look for a fleeting second like a painting of a saint. She didn't offer a complicated explanation or a story of woe. She simply spoke the truth that had guided her through the mud. "Because my child was cold," she answered, the words falling into the silence of the kitchen like stones into a deep, dark well. Arthur felt a shiver go down his spine that had nothing to do with the damp air coming through the open door. It was a reason he understood all too well, even if he had spent the last 10 years trying to forget what it felt like to care for another person's warmth. He looked at her mud-stained clothes and her swollen ankles, and for the first time in a decade, the ice around his heart felt a tiny, microscopic crack. Arthur stood there for a long time, the silence stretching between them until the only sound was the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the slate roof. He knew he should tell her to leave, to find a shelter in the village 2 miles down the road, or to call the local authorities to deal with her. But as he looked at the dark, wet road outside, and the way the wind was howling through the trees, he knew that sending her out now would be a death sentence. He was a man drowning in his own sorrow, but he was not a monster, and he could not ignore the life that was currently shivering in front of his hearth. "You can stay until the morning," he said, his voice gruff and lacking any hint of warmth, though the words themselves were a lifeline. He didn't look at her as he spoke, instead focusing on a dusty shelf where a collection of blue ceramic plates still sat exactly where Elise had left them, just until the sun comes up and the rain stops. "Then you'll have to find your own way. Do you understand?" Claire nodded silently, her shoulders dropping just a fraction as the immediate terror of being cast back into the storm began to recede. She watched as the old man moved through the kitchen with a stiff, labored gait, his movements suggesting that every joint in his body was protesting the dampness of the night. He reached into a corner cupboard and pulled out an old, moth-eaten blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. He didn't hand it to her directly. Instead, he draped it over a wooden chair near the fire, as if he were afraid that touching her might make her presence in the house too real. "Use this," he muttered, "and don't touch anything else in the house." He retreated to the small porch, sitting in an old wicker chair that creaked under his weight, leaving Claire alone in the kitchen with the dying fire. He didn't sleep. He simply sat there, staring out at the darkness, his mind a whirlwind of memories he had tried so hard to bury. He thought of Elise's wedding day, the way the sun had caught the lace of her veil, and the way she had laughed when he accidentally stepped on her dress. He thought of the nursery she had begun to prepare, and the way he had helped her paint the walls a soft, creamy white before the tragedy struck. Inside the kitchen, Claire wrapped the thin blanket around her shoulders, feeling the rough wool scratch against her skin. It was the first time in weeks she had felt even a semblance of safety, though she knew it was only a temporary reprieve from the harsh reality of her life. She looked at the old man's back through the window, seeing the way his shoulders were hunched forward, as if he were carrying the weight of the entire roof on his spine. She realized then that they were both orphans in a way, she of a family and he of a future. As the night wore on, the fire began to fade into a pile of glowing embers, and the chill of the Yorkshire moor began to seep through the stone walls. Claire didn't dare ask for more wood. She simply pulled the blanket tighter and closed her eyes, listening to the steady breathing of the house. She knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges and the return of the cold, but for tonight she had a roof over her head and a fire that had been lit for a child. She fell asleep again, this time with the quiet realization that even in the darkest of places, a small light can still find a way to burn. When the first light of dawn began to peek through the heavy clouds, the rain had finally slowed to a persistent, misty drizzle that clung to the windows like tears. Claire woke before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, her body stiff from the hard floor and her mind instantly alert to her surroundings. She didn't wait for the old man to tell her to leave. She immediately began to tidy the small space she had occupied. She folded the old blanket with meticulous care, smoothing out the wrinkles with her palms, until it looked exactly as it had when he first brought it out. She swept the stray bits of ash back into the hearth and rearranged the kindling she hadn't used, wanting to leave no trace of her intrusion other than the lingering warmth of the fire. As she prepared to step out into the muddy lane, she heard a soft, rhythmic scratching at the back door, a sound so faint she almost thought she had imagined it. She hesitated, her hand on the latch, before slowly pulling the door open just a few inches to see what was waiting on the other side. Standing in the mist was an old dog, a crossbreed with shaggy gray fur and eyes that were clouded with the haze of cataracts and many years of waiting. His tail gave a single tentative wag when he saw Claire, and he let out a low, mournful whimper that seemed to vibrate in the cool morning air. This was Barnaby, the dog Elise had rescued as a puppy, and who had disappeared into the woods on the day of her funeral. Arthur had searched for him for weeks, eventually concluding that the dog had simply gone off to die in the silence of the hills. But Barnaby had not died. He had been wandering the moors, living on scraps and memories, waiting for the house to wake up again. He didn't look at the old man first. Instead, he pushed past Claire and walked straight to the hearth, sniffing the warm stones with a deep, soulful intensity. He circled the spot where Claire had slept, then lay down with a heavy sigh, resting his chin on his front paws, as if he had finally reached the end of a very long journey. It was as if the smell of the fire had acted as a signal, a call across the miles that the cottage was no longer a tomb. Arthur came into the kitchen a moment later, his face pale and drawn from a night without sleep, and stopped dead when he saw the dog lying by the fire. His breath hitched, and for a second, the mask of cold indifference he had worn since his arrival crumbled entirely, revealing a man shattered by his own history. "Barnaby?" he whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment as he sank onto a nearby stool, his hands trembling uncontrollably. The dog didn't get up, but he thumped his tail against the floor twice, a sound that echoed through the room like a heartbeat. Claire watched from the doorway, her heart aching for the old man who was suddenly forced to confront a ghost he thought had long since vanished. She didn't try to offer comfort, knowing that some moments are too heavy for words. But she did take a step back toward the kitchen. She found an old wooden bowl in the sink, filled it with a bit of water, and placed it quietly on the floor near the dog's head. Barnaby lapped at the water slowly, and as he did, he reached out and nudged Claire's hand with his wet nose, a gesture of recognition that bridged the gap between the living and the lost. The presence of the dog changed the atmosphere of the house in a way that neither Arthur nor Claire could have anticipated. The silence was no longer heavy and suffocating. It was punctuated by the soft clicking of Barnaby's claws on the stone floor and the occasional, deep sigh he let out as he slept. Arthur didn't tell Claire to leave that morning. He looked at the muddy lane, then at her swollen ankles, and finally at the dog who seemed to have accepted her as part of the furniture. "The road is still a mess," he muttered, looking everywhere but at her face. "You can stay until the mud dries." It wasn't an invitation to stay forever, but it was a reprieve that Claire accepted with a grateful, silent nod. She didn't try to take over the house. She stayed within the boundaries of the kitchen, treating every inch of the space with a reverence that didn't go unnoticed by the old man. She found a small bag of oats and a bit of dried fruit in the larder supplies Arthur had brought with him from the city, and she prepared a simple porridge over the fire. She made enough for two, placing a bowl on the edge of the table before retreating back to her corner by the hearth. Arthur watched her from the shadows of the hallway, his mind a battlefield of conflicting emotions. He saw the way she handled the kitchen tools, with a gentleness that reminded him of Elise, but he also saw the way she moved with a cautious, guarded grace, as if she expected to be struck at any moment. He eventually sat at the table and ate the porridge, the warmth of the food feeling like a strange, forgotten luxury in his throat. They didn't speak, but the act of sharing a meal, even in total silence, began to weave a thread of connection between them that was stronger than words. As the days passed, a quiet routine began to emerge in the stone cottage, one built on a foundation of unspoken rules and shared necessity. Claire spent her time cleaning the areas of the kitchen that had been neglected for a decade, scrubbing the grime from the windows until the pale English sunlight could finally reach the floor. She never ventured into the other rooms, sensing the invisible barriers Arthur had erected around his grief. She was like a ghost herself, moving through the house with a light touch, trying to give back more than she took from the man who had given her a roof. One afternoon, Claire found a damp cloth near the window and hung it to dry on a small iron hook by the frame, not realizing it was the very spot where Elise used to hang her herbs. Arthur walked into the room and stopped, his eyes fixing on the cloth with an intensity that made Claire's heart skip a beat. "Not there," he said, his voice sharp and jagged with a pain he couldn't hide. Claire immediately took the cloth down, her face flushing with a mixture of shame and fear. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know." The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable, but instead of walking away, Arthur stood there for a moment, looking at the empty hook. He saw the way Claire's hands were shaking, and he realized that she wasn't trying to replace his daughter. She was simply trying to survive. Later that evening, he went out to the shed and returned with a piece of twine and 2 small nails. He strung the line between 2 wooden beams near the fire, creating a new place for her to hang her things. It was a small gesture, almost insignificant, but to Claire, it was the first sign that she was being allowed to exist in his world. The news of a young, pregnant stranger living in the old Montes cottage, as the locals still called it, traveled through the nearby village like a wildfire through dry grass. People spoke of it at the local pub, the Black Swan, and whispered about it over the counters of the small grocery store. They wondered who she was, where she had come from, and why Arthur, a man who hadn't spoken to a neighbor in 10 years, had suddenly opened his doors. Some were curious, others were suspicious, and a few were genuinely concerned, but none of them truly understood the fragile peace that had been established within those stone walls. Among the villagers was a woman named Mrs. Higgins, a retired nurse with a back as straight as a poker and a heart that was as tough as the moorland sheep. She had known Arthur since they were children and had been one of the few people to visit Elise in her final days. One afternoon, when the wind was particularly biting, Mrs. Higgins marched up the lane and knocked firmly on the back door, not waiting for an invitation before she stepped into the warmth of the kitchen. She looked at Claire, then at the fire, and finally at Arthur, who was sitting in his usual spot by the door. "You look like you're about to pop, girl," Mrs. Higgins said, her voice a no-nonsense rasp that cut through the quiet of the room. She didn't ask permission to examine Claire. She simply sat her down and began checking her pulse and feeling the position of the baby with expert, weathered hands. Claire was startled at first, but she sensed the kindness beneath the woman's gruff exterior and allowed herself to be cared for. Arthur watched from the corner, his expression unreadable, but he didn't protest the intrusion. Mrs. Higgins turned to Arthur, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sparse supplies on the table. "She needs more than porridge and fire, Arthur. She needs strength for what's coming. And this house needs to be ready." She left a small bundle on the table-dried chamomile, a bit of salt, some clean linen, and a small jar of honey. It wasn't an act of charity, but a demand that the house acknowledge the reality of the situation. She didn't offer a sermon on morality, or a lecture on Arthur's past. She simply reminded him that life doesn't wait for permission to be born. Before she left, Mrs. Higgins looked at Claire with a level of respect that the young woman hadn't felt in a very long time. "You're a strong one, I can see that. But even the strong need a hand when the storm gets too loud. If things start to change, you send this old man to fetch me, do you hear? Don't wait until the middle of the night." Claire nodded, a lump forming in her throat, as she realized that for the first time in her life, people were looking at her not as a burden, but as a person who mattered. When the door closed behind Mrs. Higgins, the kitchen felt strangely empty, the silence returning with a new, heavier weight. Arthur looked at the bundle on the table, his fingers tracing the edge of the clean linen. He didn't say anything, but he didn't throw the items away or tell Claire to hide them. He understood that the village was watching, and he understood that the time of hiding behind locked doors was coming to an end. The child was coming, and whether he was ready or not, the stone cottage was going to have to find a way to be a home again. At the end of a long, dimly lit hallway in the cottage sat a heavy wooden door that had remained locked since the day Arthur moved back. Claire had seen it many times, and she knew instinctively that it was the heart of the house's sorrow. Barnaby often slept in front of that door, his nose pressed against the crack at the bottom, as if he were waiting for a scent that had long since faded. Claire never asked what was behind it, respecting the boundary as if it were a sacred wall, but she couldn't help but feel the pull of the secrets that lived on the other side. One afternoon, as a fierce wind rattled the window panes and sent dust dancing through the air, a small piece of white fabric caught Claire's eye. It was peeking out from under the locked door, a scrap of lace that looked like it belonged to a different world than the dusty, gray reality of the hallway. Claire knelt down to look at it, her heart beating a little faster as she realized it was part of a baby's bonnet, delicate and fine, preserved by the darkness of the room behind the wood. She didn't touch it, but the sight of it made her realize that Elise hadn't just been a daughter, she had been a mother, to be just like her. Arthur appeared at the end of the hallway, his face darkening the moment he saw her near the door. "That room is private," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury that made Claire recoil. He wasn't angry at her, but at the memory that the door represented the future he had been promised and then robbed of, Claire stood up slowly, her hands instinctively moving to her own belly. "I wasn't trying to get in, sir. I saw something under the door, that's all. I didn't mean any harm." Arthur walked past her, his gaze fixed on the floor, and he saw the piece of lace she was talking about. He stood there for a long time, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the weight of 10 years of silence began to press down on him. He remembered the day Elise had bought that bonnet, the way she had held it up and told him that her child would be the best-dressed baby in all of Durham. He remembered the pride in her eyes. And he remembered the way that pride had turned to ash when the doctor told him they couldn't save her or the child. He turned to Claire, his eyes filled with a grief so deep it seemed to swallow the light of the hallway. "My daughter prepared that room for a son who never saw the sun," he whispered, the words sounding like they were being torn from his chest. "I thought if I kept it locked, I could keep the pain from spreading. But it doesn't work that way, does it? The pain just grows in the dark." Claire didn't have any easy answers for him. She only knew that sometimes the only way to heal a wound is to let the air get to it. That night, for the first time, Arthur didn't sit on the porch. He sat at the kitchen table with Claire, and they watched the fire together in a silence that felt more like a conversation than a void. He told her a little about Elise, how she loved the smell of rain, and how she could make even the grumpiest person smile just by walking into a room. Claire listened, and in return, she told him about her own mother, a woman she barely remembered, but who she still saw in the reflection of her own eyes. The door was still locked, but the wall between them was beginning to crumble. The storm that broke over the moor that night was the worst the region had seen in 50 years. The wind shrieked like a wounded animal, and the rain turned into a blinding sheet of water that made it impossible to see even the trees just outside the door. Inside the cottage, the air was thick with tension and the smell of ozone. Claire was sitting near the hearth when the first sharp pain rippled through her body, a sensation so intense it took her breath away and left her clutching the edge of the stone table until her knuckles turned white. She knew immediately that the time had come, but as she looked at the raging storm outside, terror gripped her heart. There was no way to get to the village, and no way for Mrs. Higgins to make it up the muddy lane in this weather. She was alone with an old man who was as fragile as a piece of glass and a dog who could do nothing but whimper in the corner. Arthur saw the change in her face and the way she was breathing, and he knew that the moment he had been dreading and perhaps secretly hoping for had arrived. "The labor is starting," he said, his voice surprisingly calm despite the panic rising in his chest. He didn't wait for her to confirm it. He immediately began to stoke the fire and move the supplies. Mrs. Higgins had left. But as the rain began to leak through a new crack in the kitchen ceiling, dripping onto the spot where Claire was sitting, he realized the kitchen was no place for a berth. There was only one dry, warm room left in the house, the one he had sworn would never be used again. He looked at Claire, who was pale and sweating, her eyes wide with a plea she didn't have to speak. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the iron key, the metal feeling cold and heavy against his skin. He walked to the end of the hallway, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his teeth. He put the key in the lock, turned it with a sharp, decisive click, and pushed the door open. The room was exactly as Elise had left it, the white curtains, the soft rug, and the small wooden cradle he had built with his own hands. "Bring her in here," Arthur said, his voice echoing through the dusty room like a command from a different era. He helped Claire into the room, his hands steady and surprisingly strong as he supported her weight. He lit a lamp and placed it on the small bedside table, the golden light illuminating the space and making the shadows retreat. He saw the way Claire looked around the room, the way she seemed to sense the love that had been poured into every corner of it, and for the first time, he didn't feel like he was losing something. He felt like he was finally finishing a job he had started long ago. The hours that followed were a blur of pain, sweat, and the sound of the storm raging outside. Arthur stayed by Claire's side, holding her hand when the contractions were at their peak and bringing her water when she was too exhausted to speak. He wasn't a doctor or a nurse, but he was a man who knew what it meant to witness the struggle for life. He whispered words of encouragement, telling her that she was strong and that her child was waiting to meet her. In that room, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, a new history was being written with every breath they took together. As the first light of a new day began to break through the clouds, a sound echoed through the stone cottage that hadn't been heard there in generations, the sharp, clear cry of a newborn baby. He was a small boy with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold the mystery of the storm he had just survived. Claire held him against her chest, her tears falling onto his forehead as she whispered his name over and over again. She was no longer an orphan, she was a mother, and the world finally felt like it had a place for her. Arthur stood in the corner of the room, his eyes wet with tears he didn't bother to wipe away. He looked at the baby, then at the photograph of Elise on the wall, and he realized that the circle had finally been completed. He wasn't replacing his daughter, and this child wasn't a substitute for the one he had lost. Instead, they were a reminder that life is a continuous stream, and that even in the wake of the most devastating loss, new hope can still find a way to bloom. He walked over to the bed and touched the baby's tiny, perfect hand, feeling a warmth that traveled all the way to his soul. The lessons we learn in life are often written in the quiet moments of struggle and the unexpected kindness of strangers. We spend so much of our time building walls to protect ourselves from the pain of the past, forgetting that those same walls also keep out the light of the future. We think that by locking our grief away in a dark room, we are preserving the memory of those we have lost, when in reality, we are only suffocating the love they left behind. A house is not made of stone and mortar. It is made of the people who choose to stay when the storm is at its loudest and the fire is at its lowest. True humanity is found in the willingness to open our doors when we are at our most vulnerable, to share our warmth with those who have none, and to recognize that every person we meet is carrying a burden we may never fully understand. We are all wanderers in the rain, looking for a hearth to call our own. And the greatest gift we can give one another is the permission to exist without being judged for our scars. To the elderly who have seen the seasons change many times, let this be a reminder that your story is not over just because a chapter is closed. There is always room for a new fire, always a reason to unlock the door, and always a child waiting to be born into a world made kinder by your presence. As the sun rose over the hills of Durham, the stone cottage was no longer a tomb of memories. It was a home filled with the smell of new beginnings and the steady, rhythmic sound of a baby's breath. Arthur sat in the kitchen, Barnaby at his feet, watching as the smoke from the chimney rose higher and higher into the clear blue sky. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but for the first time in 10 years, he wasn't afraid of the silence. He had learned that as long as there is a fire burning in the hearth and a heart willing to listen, no one ever truly has to walk through the rain alone.